NRA TV with Bill Whittle.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hot Mike Show. Hot Mike's not here today. He's having a little bit of work done. Nothing major, just tightening up around the eyes, maybe a little bit underneath the chin. But we expect him back tomorrow. Until then, I'm Bill Whittle. And today's program, we're going to be focusing on this idea of whether or not there is real, genuine bias in hiring and the actual operations. We know the press bias is there in terms of coverage, but what about the actual mechanical business of being a conservative in Hollywood or a conservative in sports, any of these major media institutions that have so much to do with shaping our society? So we'll be talking a little bit about that experience of being a conservative, especially in Hollywood, which is kind of like being the only chicken in an entire Serengeti full of lions, but nevertheless, it's an experience to discuss. So I think we'll tee this off by talking a little bit about something that happened not too long ago, and I think is an interesting case study. And this one has to do with Tim Allen. Now, Tim Allen is one of the few openly conservative people in Hollywood. He had a tremendous run with Home Improvement. He was in Galaxy Quest and so on. A tremendously successful guy. He's made a lot of money for a lot of people. He had a show on ABC called Last Man Standing. And Last Man Standing was Tim's show. Tim can do whatever he wants with it. So Last Man Standing was rumored to be somewhat conservative. Oh, by the way, he's the voice of Buzz Lightyear, by the way, as if that's not enough. But earlier this year, it was announced just about a month or so ago that Last Man Standing has been canceled, and it's been canceled despite the fact it actually had pretty solid ratings. Now, the question is, why was it canceled? And that's the question I would like to talk to right now. I think that perhaps it was canceled because of a clip from Last Man Standing, like the one you're about to see right now.
Hey, babe?
Yeah, hey.
Got a sec. I want to run the rewrite of my speech by you.
Oh, yeah, I can't wait to hear what the new PC Mike Baxter has to say.
Yeah. Well, it sounds a lot like the old Mike Baxter, but drunk in a locker room. But I'll tell you, Mandy's list was a good blueprint.
You mean of what not to say?
Oh, no, I got them all in there. All right, okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and all of you on the fence.
Oh, God.
To quote future Nobel Prize winner Lee Greenwood, I'm proud to be an American. Not just because I have the right to speak my mind or carry an awesome gun, but because it's the land of opportunity. Some whiny babies might not think so, but in America, if you work hard, anyone can be successful. Anyone. Anyone. That goes on and on. I keep doing it.
All right, you know what? You cannot give that speech. You cannot. It'll cause Mandy a lot of trouble.
With a thought police who have their panties in a bunch, and that's in there. I got that in there.
The thought police are never going to approve that speech.
You know who else would approve the speech they want me to give? Me. And God, who I'm also not allowed to mention, but I do.
We live in an interesting world where that's considered radical television. And I'm here to tell you, as somebody who lives here with Los Angeles, California, just behind me here, a mile or two or so, this is quite controversial stuff, and it's something you don't see on TV. And this is why I believe, and many other people believe, and certainly I think Tim Allen believes, that his show was canceled because it dared to produce language that supported the kind of things that pretty much all of us in the rest of flyover country really believe in. You know, he's proud to be an American. He's proud to own a gun. He's proud to believe in God. The particular clip you saw, he was given a speech to write, and it turned into a PC speech by his daughter, and he decided he wasn't going to be politically correct, so he wrote that speech. In any event, Tim was pretty blindsided by this announcement. He couldn't believe it. As I said, the numbers were pretty good. They then tried to take it to CM and NBC. Both of them passed on it. And so the question is, how do you prove, if it is possible to prove, that this show was canceled because of anti-conservative bias? Well, the problem is you can't prove it. And this is, in fact, the source of pretty much all of the problems out here. in Hollywood, if you work as a film director or if you're an editor, as I was for many years, if you're a production assistant, whatever, it's essentially a gig economy, which means that rather than putting in 30 years with a company and retiring with a gold watch, you're hired for a period of anywhere from 2 weeks to maybe 3-4 months. If you're very lucky, you get on a show that runs for a couple of years. The problem with this is if people find out that you're a conservative on a movie set or a television show, they just won't hire you for the next gig, and you'll never know why. You'll just stop getting work. Don't believe me? Well, let's bring in some evidence and an expert on this. You know, the miracle of the internet allows us to talk to people from the farthest corners of the earth, in Thailand, perhaps, just have a face-to-face conversation. It also allows us to speak to people who are about a mile or two down that way, right, Jeremy? Something like that, a mile or two down the road
if
here in
I take the
Sherman
earplug out,
Oaks,
I can hear
California.
you naturally.
That's why you've got him in. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a good friend of mine. This is Jeremy Boring. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Forward Publishing. He's co-founder of Daily Wire, which does great work with Ben Shapiro. He's also a Christian pastor. And most interestingly, he's the executive director of FOA, which is Friends of Abe, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have. But you're about to hear the limits of what you're about to hear. Jeremy, I had a little to do with that organization over many years as well. It's a group of people, and the only requirements for membership, as I recall, was that you had to love the country and that you had to be in show business out here in California. Now, I think it was you who said that Friends of Abe is not a secret organization, but it is a private organization. In other words, people know it exists, but nobody knows who's in it. I do remember that your precautions taken on the email list and not letting any information about who's in the organization out. So my question is, why are you so serious? Why so serious about protecting people's identity in Friends of Abe?
Well, we go to great lengths to protect the identity of our members because of the very things you were just discussing. You know, it's a very one-party town. Hollywood, it's a place where you're as likely to see a Democratic politician here as you are in Washington, D.C. This is where they all come to get their money before winning the elections that take them back to the East Coast. And for that reason, I think, as with any sort of singularly minded, one opinion organization, people who don't share that opinion are nervous about being discovered. But there is something that makes Hollywood unique, you know, more so than other organizations where people might feel similarly, and that's that, as you know, Bill, this is the only industry in the world where someone might take their Ivy League education, you know, a degree from Harvard Law School, where the starting pay for a graduate is something like $250,000, and someone will forgo that income, move to Hollywood, work in the mailroom of one of the big agencies for sub-minimum wage. Why? Well, because people want what Hollywood has to offer. It's not just a career. It's something more than a career. It's a place where dreams are made real. It's a place that has the loudest voice in the culture that it's possible to have, that have really shaped not only the pop culture, but the country itself in ways that politicians could only dream of. And so people risk a great deal to be here. You know, they leave their home and their families and guaranteed opportunities and come here and struggle for years and years and years. And if you finally get a little piece of that, if you carve out a space for yourself, you don't want to risk it on something as unimportant as your opinion about some political issue or who you voted for. So people keep their eyes down. They don't want to be discovered as having these sort of what Hollywood would consider radical conservative beliefs that might jeopardize the employment that they've worked and risked so much to gain.
What kind of, can you give me one or two just personal examples that you might have heard of these kind of horror stories? I recall being at a few of those meetings and seeing probably if you had to pick the toughest, the most conservative group of people in show business, in the movie and television business, I think you definitely would have to come up with the stuntmen. They just tend to be very, very conservative because they contact reality, right, Jeremy? I mean, if you're a stuntman, you make a mistake, you know, you're not going to be promoted for it.
Someone gets
Chances
hurt,
are pretty good you're going to be killed. Yeah. I've seen some very, very tough guys, very ashamed, and on one or two occasions I've seen them actually weeping because they had to sit in a makeup room surrounded by liberals who were talking about George Bush being a murderer and how all of our troops are psychopaths and we're just killing children just so we can steer their oil, right, Jim? And then this big tough guy has to make a decision on the spot. Does he want to work ever again in his life, or does he want to, be true to what he believes? So he looks at his feet and nods and goes, oh, yeah. And I've seen people, grown men, crying out of shame because of that kind of intimidation. So it's real, isn't it?
That's right. One of the stories that's always stuck with me, and we'll be careful to protect identities, of course, as we always are, but a young actor who had served in Iraq, he had done his duty, gone overseas, fought for his country, and when he got back, he thought, well, I can now pick what I want to do with my life. I think I'll go out to the West Coast and see what Hollywood's all about. He came out here, he struggled, made his way finally, and got his first big audition with a major casting agent for a role on an actual television show, not a series regular or anything like that, but an actual meaty role that had a couple lines and would expose him to several million people. And he went in, and like a lot of young actors who are just getting started, his resume was a little bit thin. And so, when you don't have a robust resume, you just put a lot of things about yourself on there, special skills, things that might start an interesting conversation with a casting director. And he had put on the resume something about his service overseas. Of course, he saw that as a good thing, something that might start a positive conversation. He gets in the room for his first big casting session. The casting director glances down at his resume, sees that he was in Iraq, and just as you said, Bill, immediately starts talking about, this war for oil, and George W. Hitler sent our boys over there to kill women and children to steal oil from brown people. On and on this goes, very vitriolic, actually calling soldiers war criminals. She rants and raves, this casting director, for about 10 minutes until she basically gets all the steam out. And then she looks over at the young actor and kind of throws the resume down and goes, well, anyway, that's my opinion. Why don't you go ahead and read the lines? At which point he had to pick up the sides off the table in front of him, look down at the 3 or 4 words that they were wondering if he was good enough to say, and channel his best method to perform, which of course is almost impossible, right? If somebody just called you a war criminal who rapes babies and takes the most important thing you've done in your life and basically calls it evil, and now dance, but now dance, monkey, dance. I want to see what you've got. So that one stuck with me.
And without any fear of any consequences, as if this is just, like talking about the weather. We both personally know a young actor who was a former Marine and went to a casting call, and the woman looked down on his resume and said, "You were a Marine?" "Yes, ma'am, I was." What on earth would a bright person like you do, throwing away years of your life on something like that? Of all the things I heard out here, Jeremy, the one that bothered me the most was hearing from a young actor formerly in the Army. And you mentioned this earlier, and we're going to come back to this after the break. The power of the dream is so many people get bitten by this show business bug. But young actors who were actual Army personnel in Iraq are hired on as actors in a movie like Redacted, where they are now playing themselves, essentially, as a bunch of murdering psychopaths. And they simply do it because the pressure to conform is so great, and because the power of the desire is so strong.
And a story that we both know is of a young actor who was horribly wounded in the war during an attack on his convoy, and he, dozens of reconstructive surgeries just to gain the semblance of humanity back in his face. During this time, he booked a role on a show, and between when he booked it and when he arrived for the role, he had another one of the dozens of reconstructive surgeries that he had, and this one allowed him to have a prosthetic nose that gave shape back to his face. And when he arrived on set, a very well-known actor, and I don't like to say names in situations like this, saw him and said, "Who told you could get a nose?" So that's the kind of...
That guy's name is Mike Schlitz, and the reason I'm not at all hesitant to give his name is because Mike is an activist for this kind of thing. I interviewed Mike on a story back in 2009, and you had to concentrate. You had to look at him and not turn away, because his face, his entire head was just scar tissue, and there was a hole where his nose used to be. His nose had been burned off in an IED, his ears, his eyebrows, his eyelashes, his eyelids, in fact. And that's exactly right. They hired him for a role as a burned veteran. He came in with a nose, and they were outraged. They were absolutely outraged that he had done something like this, given himself a nose without asking for permission. It doesn't just stop there, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just stories about dishonorable behavior. There is all kind of lewdness and sin and wallowing and in all kinds of moral filth. And we sure would hate to tease you about something like that. Yeah, that's right. So when we come back from the break, we'll be back with Jeremy Boring, talk a little bit about some of the more sleazy part of the underside of this anti-conservative wonderland called Hollywood. This is Hot Mike on NRA TV, and we'll be back in just a moment.
I'm Coleon Noir, and inside this little black box is a new NRA TV app. With it, you can stay up to date with all of your Second Amendment news and NRA lifestyle programming on your HD TV. So download it now. Don't worry, I'll wait.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Hot Mike. I'm Bill Whittle, and I'm here with my good friend and fellow conservative out here in Hollywood. I used to think it was just the two of us. Jeremy Boring, who's the chief operating officer of Forward Publishing and puts out Daily Wire, and he's also the executive director of Friends of Abe, which is an organization for conservatives in Hollywood. Jeremy, we talked about some of the things that soldiers and stuntmen and other people have had to endure in terms of just humiliation. And the decision as to whether or not they want to work and feed their families or whether or not they want to agree with all these slanders and lies against our country and the president and the servicemen and so on. But there's another side to this. And you said a line, I think it was you, oh, maybe it wasn't. But anyway, there's a line that says that every deal in Hollywood is sealed in flesh. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? This is almost unbelievable.
You know, Don Henley referred to Hollywood as Gomorrah by the sea. And I think that's pretty apt. You know, there's sort of a Babylon motif that's always been a part of Hollywood, even in the 20s. And you know, it's a place of decadence. It's a place of it's dedicated to finding ways to titillate the flesh. And so probably,
and I hate to interrupt you.
No, please.
Just very briefly, the reason I had to just charge in here is it's absolutely true. If you go to the Kodak Theater, where they have the Oscars every year now in Hollywood, the entire motif is Babylon. They've got winged lions, and they've got it's just shocking, really. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in. I remember looking around at where the Oscars are broadcast from, and I thought, what is going on?
Yeah, I mean, and it's always been that. You know, I say sometimes that when you live in L.A. long enough, pretty soon you start getting a stream of people whose grandmas knew your grandma or some other thing. They just got off the bus, fresh-faced in town, and so you take a meeting with them to kind of give them a little advice and a little shove in the right direction. And many times over the years, some wet behind the ears young actor from the Midwest will sit down across from me in the office and say, I'm a Christian and I'm just here because I want to reclaim Hollywood for Christ. And I always have to tell them, he was never here. Like, that's not what Hollywood is. That's not what Hollywood has ever been.
Yeah. No, he's away for the summer. He's up in, yeah. Got it. But even big stars, major names, basically sexual activity with producers is almost part of the deal, right? It's almost in the contract, for God's sakes.
Yeah, I think all of these are sort of the same issue. We started off talking about Last Man Standing, and my take is only very slightly different than yours. But it goes to this very topic, which is I don't believe that Last Man Standing was canceled because of the conservatism of Tim Allen or the conservatism of the show. If that were the case, Tim Allen's conservatism was known to the studio before and the network before they ever picked up the show. It's slightly more subtle than that. It's that Tim Allen's show was expensive because it had a big star. It was going into its 7th season, which is a point at which Tim Allen was in a position to renegotiate. It was at a point at which the network had to start absorbing more of the costs from the studio. There's a whole phenomenon in Hollywood where, because of the changing economy in Hollywood, in the old days, a network didn't care what studio produced the show. Now they care very much about whether or not they own a significant enough part of the back end of the show. So even though Tim Allen's show did very well on Friday nights, it was doing amazing numbers in syndication. It was an expensive show, and they were trying to move away as a network, ABC, from having multi-camera comedies on Friday night. And so in that sense, they did create a situation where you would actually ask yourself as a network, what shows do we salvage from our Friday night comedy block and which ones do we not? I don't think that it's just someone woke up one day and said, I can't stand this conservative being on the air anymore, let's fire him. But what it is that when decisions have to be made, when shows are on the bubble, when there are alternatives, that's when the sort of X factor of politics or worldview come into play. And, in that situation, the sort of embarrassment that you might feel because you have this conservative show on your network, the kind of fact that you have to shuffle your feet a little bit when you tell the people at the cocktail party down the street that you're producing this pro-Trump schlock on your air. That's when it really. We have these obvious horror stories like what happened to Mike Schlitz and others, but I do think those are the exception. The real bias that happens in Hollywood is what happened to Last Man Standing. It's that in the gray, it's always going to break against the conservative. Conservatives work. John Voight, very open with his politics, works. Clint Eastwood, very open with his politics, works. Tim Allen works. Duck Dynasty, a huge hit in its time. But when there are moments where gray happens, that's when the kind of bias really presents itself. But not to say that there's not more overt bias, but I think the overt bias, at least we can talk about it. And if George Clooney were sitting here in the room with me and heard what happened to your friend Mike, he would agree that was an outrage. But the day-to-day bias that happens against conservatives happens more subtly, and I don't think it's part of like a formal blacklist or a set agenda. It's just the result of the fact that the people who have power in Hollywood have unchecked power because the people who don't have power in Hollywood want to be a part of what this town and community offers so badly that they will suffer so many indignities. There's never pushback against the people in power. And that bad power dynamic creates bad behavior. That bad power dynamic creates bad behavior even in otherwise affable, decent fellows who would never say anything if knowingly to hurt the feelings of a conservative if they knew that the conservative was in the room. But they never have to acknowledge that there is the possibility of a conservative in the room. And so they act the way that you might act, that you might act in a locker room somewhere. They don't check themselves at all.
That's right. We really have heard so many cases, you and I personally, of those two different kinds of things. One case where somebody literally said, some producer was angry, came onto the set, and he says, "I'm really, really angry. I want to fire. I need to fire a Republican today." That kind of thing.
That certainly happens.
But as you say, untold stories that we've heard directly, untold stories of people who had great working relationships with casting directors or with certain actors or something, and then they reveal, by accident usually, that they're conservatives, and the face on their friends just is filled with amazement, really, more than hatred, just shocked. And then the next thing you know, Jeremy, the calls just don't come, right? The casting calls just don't come. And you can't say it's because of this, but you know it is. And it is
and in fact,
a
if you were to talk to
shameful thing.
That's right. If you were to talk, I'm sure that the executives at ABC right now are reading all the stories. Our own John Nolte at Daily Wire was one of the people who really brought this story to the fore about Last Man Standing with a piece that got 1.5 million page views on the day that it first broke. And I'm sure that the executives at ABC were shocked when they read these pieces, because in their mind, they didn't cancel Tim Allen's show because of his conservatism. They would be able to tell you with a straight face, that's nonsense. In fact, one of the executives did say, I don't think that Tim's politics were the main issue here, which I find kind of shockingly honest. It probably wasn't the main issue.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it wasn't the deciding issue. Because the main issues were the issues of economics and contract law and other things. But down in the quiet place, down in the gray, there's also this little bit of embarrassment. So that's the easiest one to add.
You bet. Jeremy, I'd love to do this again and soon. It's great talking to you about all this. It's great to hear an inside voice. And thanks very much for joining us from way down the street there.
Bill, thank you for having me.
Okay. You know, folks, it's really what he said. And of all the things that are the most startling to me in Hollywood, the thing that startles me the most is the absolute assumption that you are a liberal, that you would walk into meetings with a script that you're trying to sell, and it's a top-level meeting with studio people. And before they even start the meeting, they'll say, hey, okay, great, let's get going. By the way, I'm an Obama bundler. How much can I put you down for? And then you can talk to me about selling this script that is your lifelong dream. The number of people who openly just anybody, to utter complete strangers, says, these two Republicans and Donald Trump. Just the assumption that if you live in this town or certainly work in this business, you're a big old progressive. And as I say, Hollywood has the entire spectrum of political thought from far left on one hand to the extreme left on the other. So this thing is real. In any event, we'll have more stories to talk about as we get further and further into the show. It's a pleasure to be here on NRA, the home of real Americans who understand actual values. We will be back tomorrow. This is Hot Mike with Bill Whittle right here on NRA TV.